I'm not trying to argue that religion itself is just a fiction. I'm trying to argue that all truth has the structure of a fiction.
Welcome to the Deconstructionist Podcast. We are your hosts. I am Adam Narlock.
And I am John Williamson.
And I'd like you to think for a moment about the last time you were at Starbucks. I'd like you to think for a moment about the last time you walked in and ordered your, grande, non-fat, soy, 6 pumps vanilla, 1 pump hazelnut, no whip, ristretto, Americano, macchiato, or whatever it is you get at Starbucks. Maybe you're just like me and you just like some simple cold brew or whatever the bold roast of the day is if you can't find a nice local roaster like John and I are about to enjoy here in a moment. But you're at Starbucks and you mindlessly order and you mindlessly get your drink. You maybe smile. You probably don't even tip. And you may have been served by an absolute intellectual titan.
The most intelligent coffee barista ever.
Like when we were talking to the guy that you guys are about to hear this conversation, my mind went on this like ADD rabbit trail because he says like, yeah, when I was working at Starbucks, and I'm like, what? I'm like, I guess these are real people that had real, jobs.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Actually, I would love to be a barista at Starbucks. If I could make the same, kind of living that I make now in my corporate job, being a barista, dude, I would love it. My extroverted personality, being around coffee all day. Like my favorite job growing up, I was a busboy. That was my favorite job. I loved being a busboy.
I always wanted to work at a record store, but I was born a little bit too late for that.
Yeah.
Because they went the way of the dinosaur.
Or
basically.
too early because
it's
record
true.
store.
Ride that second wave, man.
You were in the black hole
Yeah.
of potential record store jobs.
The weird void.
So when Tad DeLay, who you guys are just going to get your minds blown by this guy, I could not tell you how much I enjoyed this conversation. He's talking about how he used to be a barista. And John, I just couldn't help but think like, what if, you just don't even know, like you just got served your latte by like the next Einstein or the next Freud or the next, wow.
I went to the same place. I was like, wait, what? You can't do that.
What are you doing?
No.
We just forget how real these people actually are. So tell us about who is this guy? John, tell our listeners who they're about to expect here. This guy's amazing.
I just had this thought that he hands you your latte and then tells you why it just doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter.
Or what subconscious desire you're fulfilling by coming to Starbucks and getting a latte.
You decided to get the whipped cream.
Oh my gosh!
You shouldn't have got the whipped cream. This guy is he's kind of into a bunch of different fields. So continental philosophy, theology, psychoanalysis, critical theory, and politics. The guy decided that it wasn't enough to have one master's degree, so he has 2 of them. One in philosophy of religion and one in theology. And he's currently a PhD student at Claremont. And I believe he's also a professor, right? He's teaching courses, right?
Yeah, which is pretty incredible because I don't think he even touched on this too prominently on the podcast, but he's sort of in a place theologically that's just a big question mark.
Yeah.
And doesn't necessarily believe in God in the sort of traditional sense. And yet he's a professor at a Christian university, which is just really interesting. But, his special area of expertise in the book that we talk a little bit about. We don't really get too far into the book. We're going to have to do another episode. But that's probably a good thing because this guy needed some serious introduction. But Yeah, so the guy that he's studied basically his whole life is this really mysterious figure in philosophy and psychoanalysis, Jacques Lacan, which just makes you feel intelligent
Yeah.
to just even say Jacques Lacan.
And this dude read everything in English that this guy ever wrote.
Yes. I mean, and here's a guy, Jacques Lacan, who is so difficult to understand that one of his most famous quotes, which actually I think that the book God is Unconscious that Tad DeLay wrote kind of starts off with a quote similar to this. If it's not the same quote, I'm sorry, I'm probably botching this, but Lacan says, I didn't write to be understood, I wrote in order to be read.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's just like he's so mysterious. He's, this French psychoanalyst, psychiatrist, sort of philosopher who's called the most controversial psychoanalysis since Freud. And this guy, Tad DeLay, takes this super esoteric, post-structural, psychoanalytical philosophy and applies it to beliefs and brings it to a point that, I don't know about you, but I was feeling very, not convicted in like a spiritual sense, but he points out the inconsistencies in all of us.
Yeah.
Which, man, talk about a great topic for deconstruction. And then, the cool thing about deconstruction is anytime somebody points out holes or inconsistencies, that's where you have a place to start to do reconstruction. When things kind of fall down, that's where the focus then comes to spend time, and new building and new growth kind of starts to come up. So I've been really contemplating this conversation we had with him for the last week, and I'm excited to get everybody's feedback on it and hear what everybody thinks, because I think this is one of our best.
The thing that's kind of interesting to me is coming from kind of the perspective of, I'm not really sure what I believe or where I'm at. He kind of, like some of the other really great thinkers that we've talked to, he's kind of like, well, I kind of leave it open-ended though.
Yeah.
He's like, I could end up, believing again or
right,
not.
Right. Yeah.
But
I love that.
But he's like, I refuse to stake a post in the ground right here where I'm at now, because that could change.
He's giving himself space.
Yeah.
And room.
I think that's hugely important. So
yeah, I think that's hugely important too. And I gotta say, I think we're pretty lucky to have gotten this guy when we got him.
Oh my gosh, yeah. He's gonna blow up.
I think so too, man. I think a few years from now, everybody's gonna be talking about Tad DeLay.
Yeah. And he's been, if you guys follow some of the other podcasts out there, he's been on shows like Life After God, Homebrewed Christianity, and our buddy on our friends with Freestyle Christianity too. So he's done a few other interviews, but really just not a ton yet. But I think he's gonna get going as word gets out here.
Man, let's roll tape on this, and we can debrief a little bit afterwards.
Sounds good.
Without further ado, the mysterious, the inspiring, the interesting Tad DeLay.
You shake the beast, you're gonna get the teeth. I pull the root, you sow that seed. Truth like love, it's hard to find.
All right, Tad DeLay. Welcome to the Deconstructionists podcast.
Hey, I'm glad to be here.
We are super excited to have you here, friend. You are, it's kind of like Pete Holmes does the Friends of Rob Bell.
Yeah.
We're doing the Friends of Pete Rollins.
That's something like that. Yeah. Yeah, Pete told me that you guys might be reaching out, so it's good to get in touch finally.
I'm glad that he actually remembers us. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, I listened to your interview with him and it went pretty well, so yeah, I feel like I kind of know what you guys are up to, and so I feel like it should be a pretty good time.
I think we're going to have a great time here. I think the best place to start is, your work's just kind of starting out. You're blowing up in a lot of the definitely the academic circles, and being connected with Pete and doing some podcasts and stuff. People are kind of starting to talk about this Tad DeLay guy and what he's doing with all these really obscure thinkers and people that it's people haven't even heard of and all this kind of stuff. And I want to get into all of that, but where I want to start is just you, man. Just you've got a really interesting story that is going to connect with so many people from so many different spectrums of our podcast. So what I'd love to do is just start out about like kind of who you are, where you are personally, spiritually, professionally, and talk a little bit about your evangelical upbringing and that short stint as a pastor that went off like a flare that you had there.
Yeah, well, I guess one of the things that I really want people to always know about the work that I do is that it is completely is abstract and as complicated as it seems that I can make things. It is completely grounded in this world that I come out of. I grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas, in a very conservative evangelical setting, and I was one of those kids who was always in church, always volunteering for everything, doing the mission trips. And then probably around sort of late high school, I decided that I was interested in going into ministry full time as an adult. So I, sort of did my college internships to that, in that direction. And always loved it. And then, somewhere along the line, I guess I started having a reading a bit more philosophy and a bit more theology, and that was challenging to the very sort of dogmatic beliefs that I was raised with. But I always still really enjoyed it, and I absolutely loved the people. And then towards the end of college, really, I started working with a number of church plants, and they all seem to be catastrophically awful. But one in particular, this is one of the most bizarre. I don't know if anything more bizarre will ever happen to me than this particular story. I was working with this one church plant. And so, I'd been on staff for just a little bit of time, and my views around the gay issue, I guess we say evolved, matured, perhaps. So I started reworking some of the things that I'd sort of my inherited beliefs, and started kind of realizing that what I had always thought just wasn't working for me anymore, not for my friends and family and people that I knew. So one day I told my senior pastor that I was starting to change some perspectives on things. And I had that discussion, and I don't mean to make myself a martyr. I had no idea it would be a big deal, because we always kind of emphasized openness in our congregation and differences of perspective. Which there's not a lot of that in Arkansas, so that was something that
you guys were really pioneering. You were trailblazing out there.
Just being nice to people as a whole, right? So so I honestly had no idea it was be a big deal. And, he kind of didn't say much at the time, called me back the next day and said we needed to meet. And then I was told my services would no longer be needed. And that, like the whole thing, and I guess at the time he sort of couched it in a few other things. He said, I'm not sure that you believe the same thing as you're supposed to about, hell or atonement or some other thing. But it was always the thing about being gay not being a sin. That was like the big thing, right? I didn't really understand what had happened at the time. It was really, really traumatic. It caught me completely off guard, and I had a few friends that were part of that really stood up for me, and that was great. But then I had other friends that I had been super close with since middle school, perhaps. Who seemed really supportive of this guy getting rid of me, and that was really difficult.
Oh man!
And then so that happened for sort of this 9-month period, and in this 9-month period, I kind of decided, well, I really care a whole lot about philosophy and theology, but I'm not sure that I ever want to be in a position where my income is attached to that again, just because I want to be as free as possible to think. And for some reason, I thought that the teaching at a college would be a whole lot different. I guess it is, to some degree, but there's still all those same politics in universities. So I decided that I wanted to go the academic route. So I actually decided to go to seminary as sort of a staging ground for a PhD.
Wow.
After deciding that I no longer wanted to do the pastoral thing. But then after I'd made that decision, and this is kind of where it gets super weird, I awoke to an email one day. A buddy from that old church had sent me a link, and he said, you need to see this, Tad. So I click on it, and it's my former pastor, again, who had fired me for being affirming of gay people. He has been arrested for having a relationship with an underage boy.
Wow.
Yeah, so this is like only, I mean, this is going on 7 years ago, and it's just now something that I'm starting to feel comfortable talking about in any capacity, because even, it's just a bizarre story. I mean, so part of what made it so bizarre was like it kind of became very apparent that it wasn't even my views on gay people that was what he needed to get rid of so much as just to appear more safe, I guess.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and then the weirdest part is probably a lot of the people who had supported him that again, some of which I had known since middle school, and been very close to. Some of those people actually became even more hostile towards me afterwards, after it became apparent that getting rid of
Really?
yeah, so and that's been sort of one of the questions about how belief works. That's always operated in the background for me because it's not as if these were bad people, right? Like I don't think of them as like supporting this pedophile, right? Like I
Right.
don't think of them as like evil people, but there is something I think, especially in evangelical culture, that can see progressive beliefs as actually worse in a way than a temporary moral failing that God can sort of reel you back from. Does that make sense?
I've seen
Yeah,
that.
absolutely.
So I've seen that more times than I care to recount.
Right. And it's not that they're like a bad person. It's just like this, like we find ways to expel the outsider, expel the symbol that sort of reminds us of a part of us, right? So if I
Hmm.
became a symbol of somebody making a really bad call, like it's just easier to kind of get rid of me, I guess, altogether. And so, as a result, so I'm very happy with where I am and what I'm doing now, and have a whole different kind of social circle now. But, a lot of like, I've never actually had one person from that phase of life ever come back and apologize for that. And in a weird way, that kind of makes sense how that works.
Man, so that really was formative in
That
how
was
you chose the rest of your academic career.
Well, it was formative in the sense that, like, it got me off the pastoral route and it gave me kind of an introductory lesson in how people select and disavow beliefs.
Mm.
Uh, Not much of what I do day to day really has anything to do with that, but that has always kind of been in the background, this kind of picture of how we dispense with outsiders, how we trick ourselves. Maybe might be a way to say it. There's a very crude way to say it, but how we trick ourselves into thinking that we believe things that we don't necessarily believe.
I am nothing without pretend I know my thoughts can live with them. I am nothing without a man. I know my faults, but I can hide them. I still keep my
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, at Fuller and then beyond Fuller, what are some of the things that you learned? What are some of the programs that, what kind of, not necessarily degrees, but, focuses, or, what do you want? Tell us a little bit about kind of who you are academically and what that means for the work you're doing right now.
Okay, well, so I graduated. I'm the first in my family, I believe, to ever even go to college. But then, so I majored in psychology, but I never really did a whole lot of psych theory until I actually got to Fuller. And then through a series of scholars became exposed to psychoanalytic theory. And, in college, like, psychoanalysis day is like one day in a theories class and it's not really explored, right?
It's
So
like, okay, yeah, we covered that. Yep. Okay, moving right along.
right. And I didn't actually have any clue that psychoanalysis was still like an extremely serious discourse within humanities theories. So I didn't actually, so I managed to get through a bachelor's in psychology before realizing that anyone still read this stuff and studied it. So I started reading psychoanalysis, a little bit of Freud. I was a little bit introduced to it through the work of Meryl Westphal, and then an advisor of mine named Clayton Crockett, who's a very well-known scholar in my world, and a few others. And then around that same time, I was starting to read Pete. and starting to read Zizek, who influences him quite a bit, and then his
Yeah.
character Khan that I study now. But it was really in that seminary period where I started reading this material, and I just attached to it in a way that I didn't attach to any other philosophical strand. Like so Zizek uses this one example of like, he'll use the term disavow, and he says, in psychoanalysis you have this concept called fetish disavow, and what that is you cannot enjoy you unless you have this fetish, right? So without getting too crass about how that works, for example, he says, when somebody says like, are we doing damage to our environment, right? And they kind of say, well, maybe, maybe not. But then you walk outside and the air feels good and the sky is clear, and you look at this big blue sky and you think, well, we couldn't possibly be doing anything to a world this big. We're not that big or whatever. So like the symbol of like a blue sky, or the fact that there is wind outside and it feels kind of good outside today, can be a way to fetishistically disavow what we actually know to be true. Right.
Wow.
So I started seeing examples of this, I guess, everywhere, like all throughout theology. It seemed like there were so many things that we would kind of know, okay, this idea doesn't really work that well. But as long as we can come up with some crappy, super abstract argument, then we can sort of pretend as if this idea would work if we just got all the pieces together in the right place.
Okay,
Right?
I love this. You got to give me an example. I would love it if you gave me an example. This stuff, I love this stuff.
Okay. I'm trying to think.
Anything.
Okay. Here's one way that this sort of plays out for me. So I came across this quote by this Jewish rabbi, Abraham Joshua Heschel. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
Absolutely.
Yes, he has this quote that I absolutely love in his book God in Search of Man, which already God in Search of Man, right? Like you already know he's playing with your note, because a God doesn't have to look very far for someone, right?
Yes.
So you already know that he's playing with you. And he has this quote that goes, I got it here: intellectual honesty is one of the supreme goals of philosophy of religion, just as self-deception is the chief source of corruption in religious thinking, more deadly than error. And this is a part that I really like. He says, hypocrisy, rather than heresy, is the cause of spiritual decay.
Oh,
And so that's always stuck with me, because okay, but the thing is like, hypocrisy actually can be a primary value for a culture, especially when you have a very dogmatic culture where you're supposed to believe certain things. It actually can very quickly become, all right, we need to disavow this difference. We just need to lie to ourselves, or we need to only participate with people who are going to participate in this myth along with us.
right.
So maybe here's an example. So here's one thing. I was discussing this with one of my old professors just the other day. This is something, what I'm about to say, that like I cannot tell you how many people I know that experience absolute dread because they feel like their churches or their universities are requiring them to lie. So here's one thing that you learn on the first day of a hermeneutics class. So after you've done your Greek and your Hebrew, and you're all sitting together with 50 people in a room projecting old manuscripts on the board, and you're comparing different manuscripts and seeing how they differ of the New Testament, right? So we have, here's the thing you learn on the first day. We have 5,300 first millennium Greek manuscripts, at least 5,300,
Yes.
and probably another 10,000 or so smaller parts. Not any two of them match. All right, so
Really?
5,300. No two of them are exactly alike. That means, okay, so you as a pastor, you go to seminary, you accumulate $100,000 in student loans, and then you graduate, and a church tells you, okay, you can have this job and all the security along with it, only on condition that you sign the statement about inerrancy. We don't need to hear that we don't need to hear anything that you learned about how to compare differing manuscripts. We don't need to hear how, we don't actually necessarily know what any single New Testament book looked like, right? We don't have the original manuscript. Now we can get really, really close, right? But as for if our life depended on it, we could not with certainty reconstruct any particular document perfectly. right? But we're still expected to sort of play along in this game as if we could, right? Where it's just a matter of translating properly or understanding context more, where there's no real threat. It's just a matter of honing basically the beliefs that we already have, right? So I think that that's kind of an interesting way for me. So I have a lot of friends that will talk about, this is a really troubling thing to have to be required to pretend to believe, right?
Yes.
Because there's no such thing as someone who, and I know this is probably going to sound arrogant of me to say, but really there is no such thing as a scholar who's seriously studied the material and been well educated on it who would believe in something like inerrancy. Like that's just because that's the opposite of what it takes to do biblical studies. Biblical studies is admitting that there are all sorts of errors in a text, and we need to kind of look through and think about why those errors might be there, what it says about the community, how we have changed ideas about God over time.
Absolutely.
And most of the time, those errors are not significant. A lot of times, they're simply exchanging a the for an an or something similar like that.
Right.
Occasionally, they're removing entire chapters. Occasionally, entire parables jump from one gospel to the other. Occasionally, the word "we are saved by the Father, Son, and Holy Water" changes to Father, Son, and Holy Spirit after after the Council of Nicaea adopts the Trinity doctrine. Right.
Yeah.
So occasionally they're big, but you're supposed to pretend as if those don't exist. I guess.
Absolutely.
Right. So those are the types of things that we like to disavow, and I'm interested in how communities sort of develop this group cohesion precisely by pretending as if certain things aren't true, that sort of in many ways run contrary to the whole purpose of that community.
Yeah, we just had a conversation with a guy named Greg Boyd. He's I think he has a degree in philosophy actually from U of M.
Yeah.
He's a pastor up in Minnesota.
Familiar with him?
He
Yeah.
talks about a lot about the anti-intellectualism in the church and especially in the clergy that he just can't stand. This sort of spiritual agoraphobia, which it sounds to me like you're saying the same thing. It's like this: you are not allowed to pull the blinds shut, keep the door locked, and like all these truths exist within this house that we've constructed, and don't wander outside of this. You're not allowed to.
Right. Yeah. I think there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, always lost on dogmatic religious people is how truly little Jesus got along with dogmatic religious people, right? So, but we seem to think that it's okay to be part of the tribe of certainty and the guardians of morality and all that crazy stuff, as if our supposed savior would have anything to do with that, right?
Right.
And that's Greg Boyd talking up in the north. I mean, I'm from the Bible Belt, so it works even worse down here. Yeah.
So at this point, you're working on your PhD. You've gone through Fuller, and I'm just curious, where do you find yourself spiritually now, as well as how is that translated into your professional career?
That is a hard question, I think.
Good. We like hard questions.
I'm still not quite sure. There's, I guess the most honest I could be about it is that studying this material does make for it makes it incredibly difficult not to be completely skeptical all the time, and I think that that's actually a good thing. I occasionally go to church, very occasionally. I'm not a particularly good Christian about that, but I do occasionally, but not super regularly. But at the same time, studying this material every day gives me such a deeper appreciation for it than I would have had when I was at church 5 times a week. So it's this weird conflicted feeling. Like there's a lot of messed up material in it, right? There's a lot of abuse in this system. There's a lot of anti-intellectualism, and then I also see a lot of goodness coming out of it too. I see a lot of people that find a lot of life in it. So I don't quite know what to think. And I guess maybe something I should add in is that part of my work is sort of conditioned on the idea that the things that we do and believe isn't something that we really choose all that much. It's not really that your beliefs, you don't really choose your beliefs so much as your beliefs choose you. Right.
Wow.
Like you don't actually, like most people don't say like, I would like to stop believing in God today. And most atheists don't say like, I'd like to suddenly start believing in God today. Right. You can
Wow.
have sort of like a disposition that you tend to operate out of. And I can try to have one disposition or the other as best I can. But it's not ultimately up to me. Like I'm sort of one personal catastrophe away from changing my views on something. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't. So that's kind of always in flux to me. I'm not trying to be evasive on it. I don't want to overstate
No,
my case on something.
that was such a good answer that I'm literally scratching one of my questions completely off my list here.
Good. All right.
'Cause
Close.
that just
All
that
right.
just answered a couple questions.
So
Okay.
I guess I'm curious to know if just because we have a broad spectrum of listeners from completely, and I'll just use a generic term, grouped into kind of the non-religious kind of side of things in it, all the way over to what who would be considered more conservative, fundamentalists, what have you.
Yeah. I've probably already done a terrible job of alienating people.
No.
It's what we do, man.
Yeah.
All right.
It's
Very good.
what,
Very
it's
good.
what we do.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Go
No,
ahead.
no, you're absolutely fine. I'm just always very, very curious in kind of learning about people's individual journeys. So I'm just curious if there was a specific period of time, I guess, through kind of your questioning. It sounds like, hermeneutics may have been one of those courses where you're like, oh, wait a minute here.
Mm-hmm.
And I know in other interviews you've mentioned taking archaeology and things of that nature. Was there a specific time that you look back to where you're like, okay, things are starting to unravel a little, or was it just kind of a gradual,
Yes. No. There was there was a specific year, and then there were specific conversations within that year. I took a year off of college and lived in California with some friends for a while, like back when I was like 20 or so, and that's when my beliefs started to really reorganize themselves. And it was really, at first, it was just because I was really lonely at the time and spent because I moved to a place where I didn't know that many people, and
Sure.
I dealt with that for a few months by just reading a lot. So so I was at the libraries or Barnes and Noble or whatever, just reading a lot. And that was the sort of this time when I started actually reading real theology and real philosophy. So that was part of it. But here's the thing, though. I was still, around that time, I had a few good friends who were very much in like traditional church world. And so I'd be rethinking some things on my own, while I'm kind of dealing with like sadness of being far away from home, like loneliness of not having a whole lot of friends around at the time, and just kind of working a job at Starbucks. So I'm kind of in this like angsty condition to begin with, and I'm also rethinking a lot of things that may or may not have to do with the eternal state of my soul. Right. So I'm doing all that. And I remember one day I had recently, there was this one particular pastor I had who said kind of terrible things, but they were also things that were the logical extension of everything I had ever believed. And so it was kind of, in a way, it kind of let me kind of mirror and figure out where does this idea go. So I brought to him one day, like I had just learned that I guess, for instance, the word hell, like that was a very, hell is an important belief in evangelicalism, right? Like it's not something that you can kind of say like, maybe. Like if there's a hell, that's a really big deal, right?
Yeah.
Like like that is actually the most important thing to your entire life, if there is such a thing, right?
Sure.
Actually, I have a story on that in a minute.
I'd love to hear it.
So I had just learned, for instance, that the word hell appears anywhere from 0 to 17 times, depending on how accurate the translation is, and that none of the three words that mean hell actually translate to what we mean by hell in English, usually.
Like eternal conscious torment, you mean?
Right. Yeah. Like so, there's Gehenna, Tartarus. Hades.
Sheol,
and Sheol in the Old Testament, right? So in the Hebrew Bible, it's got it like another 39 times if it's a King James version. But basically, I kind of learned that the gist was the fewer hells it has, probably the more accurate the translation, because none of these really mean quite what we think of, at least.
Wow.
So I just kind of posed an innocent question to this pastor of mine one day. And I said, like, why didn't I ever hear this? That's an interesting idea that like the word hell as we think of it doesn't necessarily quite exist in the New Testament, not the way I was taught, at least. And his response was, well, you should be beyond asking that question. And I was
What?
like, yeah, I was like, oh man, like that's an interesting thing. Like when you're prohibiting a question by
Right.
saying like, that shouldn't even be on your mind. So he had a few other good ones. He had a few other good ones. Here we go. All right. So, this guy was like really instrumental for me to getting over some of these things, because again, he's kind of showing me where his ideas go, which were my ideas before.
Oh man, I get that.
Yeah, so he told me one time, kind of on that same issue, I was like, why isn't that our church doesn't really do that much philanthropy? Like, why aren't we giving to the poor very much? We seem to like invest a lot in like missions and like things that kind of get people in, and like missions overseas, but we don't actually just like give money away to help feed people or whatever. And he said, Tad, like that's a good question, but like at the end of the day, you got to think about it like this: if you give money to feeding people instead of giving money to a missionary who might convert them, then there is the chance that somebody is going to get fed but spend eternity in hell. So if you think
Wow.
now, like, so that sounds really dumb, right? Like when you say it like that, like, but that's actually true, right? Like if there is such a thing as hell,
Right.
actually,
Absolutely.
you're a terrible person if you give money to people out of your budget that could be spent converting them. Like you're actually a horrible person, like under that paradigm. And then he also said something to the effect of, I asked once, like, like we don't seem to do very much like creation care of any kinds. Like we don't seem to like, and he kind of said like, well, yeah, we don't do much creation care, but like, look at it this way. Like, even if we believed like what like climate science says, like we don't, but even if we did, you've got to think about it this way. God's going to come back and destroy the world very soon. So you're actually kind of working against God if you recycle, until he's,
Dude.
and he'd say things like, those are not outliers. That's the thing, is those are completely consistent beliefs. Like
Those
he's
are.
just being like someone who's really held on strong and faithfully to the same world that I grew up in, right? Like, and I can't fault him for that. If he had all sorts of hypocrisies in there, then maybe, but in as much as he's just staying like true to the faith, then like I understand where that's going. And but it was like hearing those happen, like that's what was helpful to me.
Yeah,
Absolutely. There's a story of that I use in my, so I have this book, God is Unconscious, and then I'm writing another one right now that'll hopefully be out by the end of the year or early 2017. That's like at a more accessible level. So I'm trying to get this theory out to the public or whatever. And one of the stories I use in it is there was this prisoner, I think one of the last men to be hung in England, named Charles Frederick Peace. And he was a prisoner whose guilt was not under question. He was a brutal murderer. Absolutely no question about that. But he, so the story goes, he's being led out to the gallows, and this is a time when the crowds would, gather around the entire town to watch somebody be hung, right? So he's being led out, this disgusting figure, and there's a priest following behind him, reading from his prayer book, recant and you will be saved, don't recant and you will be consumed by the flames of hell, et cetera, right? So he's doing this whole thing. So the priest is doing this, and at one point, this prisoner called Peace turns around and looks at the priest in the eye, and he says, do you really believe that? Do you really believe that I'm going to spend all eternity in hell starting in a couple minutes from now? And this priest, kind of is taken aback, and he says, like, of course, I'm a priest, of course I believe that, right? Like, what are you even saying?
Yeah.
And Peace goes, well, I don't, but here, and this is like, this is supposedly like sort of pretty close to verbatim what he said. He goes, I don't believe that. But if I did, let me tell you what I would do. I would crawl on hand and knee over broken glass from one coast of England to the other, preaching the gospel 24/7, if it took that just to save a single soul, if I believed in a God like yours. So
Wow.
I said, and then of course at the end, Peace doesn't repent, and neither does the priest.
Man.
Right?
Wow.
But they're both
I mean,
exposed.
right, yeah. And it's arguments about like who has the correct belief. Priest just kind of turns around and says, you don't, like, you just don't believe as much as you think you do. That's the only difference between us. Neither one of us believe this. I'm just going to admit it and then get up on the gallows and go to sleep.
I read an article once a while back in the Atlantic. Everybody's always really hot and bothered with people trying to convert other people.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, stop trying to convert me. No, you stop trying to convert me. We should all stop trying to convert everybody. And there's this one, I can't remember her name right now, but it was such an intelligent article. It's probably 6-7 years ago in the Atlantic, and she was talking about why she thinks that you are an unloving Christian if you call yourself a Christian, but you are incredibly unloving. In fact, you are sadistic to the nth degree, like worse than Hitler could have ever been. If you don't try with every breath you muster to convert me every waking minute of every single day. Like, if you believe that, because I'm an atheist, or, because I'm gay, or because of whatever, that I'm going to burn forever in eternal conscious torment, like one famous pastor always used to say, well, hell is hot and forever's a long time, But if you're not going to try to convert me, then I think that you're sadistic, that you're a monster. So she was advocating. It was a call for Christians to become more evangelical. It was amazing. And that was one of those rupturing moments for me that I was like, I'm not standing on the street corners preaching with a sandwich board. In fact, that guy with a lunatic and a bullhorn with the sandwich board on campus telling everybody they're going to burn in hell is actually a much more consistent person than I am.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And
things
even
kind of
to take
unraveled
breaks.
from there.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so that's kind of like, so like in psychoanalysis, basically, it's the unconscious that is the truth. It's never your conscious manifestation. It's the unconscious.
Whoa. Okay, explain that a little bit. I don't know a lot about psychology. That's I know that's something deep though.
Right. Well, so like when we sort of in the Freudian and Lacanian tradition talk about an unconscious, what we're not talking about is a subconscious that actually exists. So when I say subconscious, I might be talking about neurons firing in my mind or synapses firing that I am not aware of, right? Things that are, so like right now I have synapses firing that are controlling my heartbeat and breath, right? Breath. But I'm not thinking about that. But like we could call that like sort of at a subconscious level, my brain is working. So just to be clear, that's not what I'm talking about. Like when we as psychoanalysts say unconscious, we're talking about the structure of how people actually behave without any sort of regard for how they think they behave or how they reason themselves into behaving. So your unconscious is your truth, like sort of. So like this is kind of
okay.
in like this is caught up in like the most sort of basic level when someone says like. I think our friend Pete says this, before, like something to the effect of, you don't have to tell me whether you're in favor of child labor. I can look at the back of the tag on your shirt and tell you if you're in favor of child labor, right? Okay, so that's a sort of very rudimentary an example of how an unconscious truth works, right? So that's your actual existence, right? So the analyst, when you go into analysis, you come into analysis and you're thinking, I don't understand why I'm getting caught up in these bad relationships. Why do my friendships keep fraying? Why does every person I date, why does it always end the same way or something like that, right? I don't want that. All right. And the analyst says, yes, I know that you don't want that, but at the same time, you kind of do, right? Like, so you're constructing relationships around you such that you're not able to trust fully, or you're, for whatever reason that probably goes back into your rent childhood, you are looking for people who will betray you and let you down, right? So it's actually yeah, I mean, kind of getting back to like how this works in theology, right? Like, you can find like any crafty reason to believe anything that you want. There is a very, very good chance, almost certain, that everything you believe is at least partly wrong 100% of the time, right? And so, what is it covering up for, right? Like, that's the interesting question: is
I
what is it
love
covering up
that.
for? Do you live substantially differently because of this belief? Because, like, I know, for example, when I stopped believing in like the version of hell that I grew up in, to use our earlier example,
Yeah.
that didn't actually change that much about my behavior. That changed like my behavior for like one weekend out of the year when I would have been on a mission trip, but that's about it, right? Like, so I
Yeah.
obviously didn't actually ever really believe it that much, right? And my wager is that we could find that throughout everything that we believe. And it's not just to say
Wow.
that theology is a fiction. I'm saying the structure of everything is a fiction, right? Like everything that we tell ourselves is retrojected to convince ourselves that we are a particular version that we aren't necessarily.
So, okay, this is maybe you're probably going to listen to me right now and be like, "Oh man, nice try, Adam. Let me explain all of that again to you." But maybe I might be connecting some dots here that we talk about on the podcast quite a bit when we talk about beliefs and our unconscious biases. So we talked in one of our earlier episodes about how we have systemic biases, we have affinity biases, but you know the big one that we talk about a lot is a confirmation bias, and that we're all living out this confirmation bias on a regular basis. That you've got
Right.
these inherent, maybe even inherent beliefs, and what you're constantly trying to do, even though you don't realize it, is filter out anything that disagrees with that and accept and magnify anything that confirms it. So isn't it funny that I realized one day that all the books on my bookshelf were footnotes of the other books on my bookshelf. They were the bibliography. You know what I'm saying? They were the
Right.
bibliography. It's like, wait a second. It was like moment of clarity. I think something's wrong here. If what I'm really trying to do is learn, all I'm hearing is I'm telling myself the same story over and over and over again because I've got this giant confirmation bias that I didn't realize. It sounds to me like when you're talking about how psychoanalysis helps us to think about not so much what the correct belief is, but how our beliefs work, you know, how we repress, how we disavow. Am I connecting dots that shouldn't be connected there?
No, I think that that's great. Yeah, so
Thank
like
you. Thank
I
you.
mean,
I feel better now.
no, it is. It is. I mean, like a proper orthodox Lacanian psychoanalysis can be just as irritating as a proper orthodox like Calvinist or some things like that, right?
Sure.
Like we can all be just as terrible. But so they might quibble with some of that. But no, I think that that's true. That's we at a basic level seek pleasure, and it's less unpleasurable to just keep believing whatever we believe already. So if the matter is pleasure, then why not just keep believing basically the same thing, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things that so an example I use in God is Unconscious, and then I'll use it again like in this next book, The Cynic and the Fool, is that there's this philosopher of science called Thomas Kuhn who talks about how paradigms shift. And one of his examples is when you look through, like there's sort of this normal science where we build constructively one belief to another. And maybe it's influenced by confirmation bias, but maybe it's just really good science, right?
Yeah.
But then there are these moments where this punctuated equilibrium where we shift to a different idea. Right. So when we were switching from the Ptolemaic universe to the Copernican heliocentric model,
Right.
It wasn't a case that we had just better evidence for Copernicus right off. Like the equations worked out about the same either way with very minor differences. We didn't have technology, right? So there comes a point in which we shift from one reason to another. And sometimes this guy Kuhn sometimes says, well, sometimes it's as simple as like the old regime just dies off and like newer scientists with different ideas come into the fray. And he says, the interesting thing is this does not happen in theology because we don't have any sort of, like, it doesn't matter what the average person thinks of the disparities between quantum mechanics and string theory, right? That doesn't matter. Like, you don't get a say, right?
Yeah.
But everybody gets to be their own favorite theologian. So there's not sort of progress. But anyways, so Kuhn sort of talks about how paradigms shift, and then a few other philosophers of science, Quine and a few other characters talk about how basically what happens is our experiences start bumping up against the network of things that we know. And then once those experience, if you think of like kind of this whole interconnecting circular network of things that we know, experiences start bouncing up against it. We get errant data, and then occasionally we decide it's actually simpler if we just disregard this whole theory and come up with a new idea to explain it. So
Wow.
yeah. So okay, so think about it this way: if the internet, if we drew out, you can actually find this online if you want to find it. But if you drew out a connection between every website on the internet to all the websites that it has hyperlinks to it, right? It would be really clear pretty quick which sites are the big clusters called Facebook and Google.
It
right?
wouldn't be my yeah. Yeah, it wouldn't be our website.
It wouldn't be yeah, right. So okay, so let's just say that networks desire homeostasis or epistemic stasis or network stasis in the same way that bodies desire homeostasis, right? If the internet had to decide whether to get rid of your website or Google based on which keeps it mostly the same, which would it prefer? Like, it would definitely prefer to just get rid of your website, right? So you'd think, based on sort of the way that science progresses, that religion would kind of work the same way. Like, we'd want to hold on to our big beliefs and put all of our energy into defending the big beliefs that are really part of our identity, and then let the other beliefs that conflict with reality go, right? So I'm going to keep believing in God, but I'm going to let go of this other idea that's causing trouble for me, right?
Yeah.
So a weird thing happens in religion, though, because we find, I mean, kind of going back to what I was saying with regard to fetish disavowal earlier,
Right.
we actually seem to select fetishized ideas and those at all costs, right? So when I was raised in that part of the world where 1 in 3 people are creationists, so like I understand that because I was raised in that world, I actually kind of knew that it didn't work, but I wouldn't want to admit that to myself, because if creationism is wrong, then I would feel like Genesis is not trustworthy. And if Genesis is not trustworthy, then the whole Bible might not be trustworthy.
Right.
And if the whole Bible's not trustworthy, then there's no God. And if there's no God, there's no afterlife and no meaning to life, and everything is terrible, right?
Everything falls apart.
The House of Cards theology, yeah.
House of Cards, right? So we end up, instead of the way that sort of science progresses, in religion we tend to actually defend not the big cluster, not the Google, but we actually defend like the smallest idea that has nothing to do with the way that we live the rest of our lives. It's just that it is guarding, like it is the guard post. And once we lose that, we know that we're going to feel anxiety and then doubt the next thing and then doubt the next thing and then doubt the next thing.
Yeah.
So in psychoanalysis, anxiety is the cause of doubt. Like, you never choose to doubt something. You actually prefer to be ambiguous about things because it lets ideas that don't work stay and work, right?
Yes.
So it's actually better to just be ambiguous about it, because once you start to feel anxious, then you'll start to doubt. And once you start to doubt, you don't have a control over where that goes. So just to keep not being ambiguous. So a lot of people think that like they want to be certain, but you actually don't want to be certain. You actually want to be ambiguous and indifferent to ideas, and that's the best form of certainty. So here's an example for that, and then I'll shut up.
I love this.
Keep going.
Go,
Okay,
you go, man.
That's how this goes. When I leave the house in the morning, I'm a good obsessional neurotic, so I start to wonder, did I leave the gas on today? Will my house blow up, right? So we've all had this experience at some point. I probably just have this more than most people, right? So I worry that the gas is left on at my house. Now, when I'm sitting out in my car deciding whether to go to coffee or to go back into my house and check the gas on the oven, I feel like I have like an ambiguity to whether or not my house could blow up right then, right? Like, so I kind of trick myself into feeling like, actually, I'm kind of safe as long as I'm sitting here wondering whether I need to go back. Like, my house is probably not going to blow up for the next 2 minutes, but I need to decide, and then my house might blow up. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right? It's actually in that ambiguous space. That's actually where you feel safety, right? It's not in certainty that my house is fine, right? Actually, if I decide that I'm certain my house is fine and I drive off, I'm still going to think about it, right? It's actually an ambiguous space where I don't really think about it that hard, and where I kind of feel like nothing could happen right now. And it's not until I decide I need to go back and turn the gas off that I actually feel real anxiety that my house might blow up, right? So we kind of trick ourselves. into thinking that we want certainty. But my claim was that what we actually want is ambiguity and indifference, because those are the best kind of certainty that we can have, because that's where we sort of trick ourselves into thinking that things don't matter. And I'd wager that that is all across our theological ideas, right? If I go back home and visit and someone gets into a theological argument with me, they know that I can probably run circles around them pretty quick if I want to. Like, if I want to be a complete
I think that's a fair wager at this point, Tad. Yeah.
right. So like, it's actually better not to have that conversation. And I don't want to have that too. If I'm unsure of something, I would prefer to just, if I'm not sure. So like, if I wrote a book and I think that maybe I had something that I wrote that isn't completely accurate, I'd rather just not look that up. I'd rather leave it ambiguous, indifferent.
Yeah, absolutely.
The moment that I concretize it, I can start to feel anxious, and then I can start to doubt, and I can realize that I'm in trouble, right? So we do that with everything, right? Like, you prefer not to deal with that argument that you're having with your spouse, right? You prefer to just leave that alone so that things will go away, right? You prefer not to think about the ideas that you have that don't work, right? It's actually better just to leave them alone. Like, so ambiguity is kind of the best kind of certainty, but it's toxic in a way.
Man, that is, dude, this, I'm totally stealing Pete Holmes' line. This is a free podcast, man.
Yeah.
We're not charging for this.
Perhaps we should.
Maybe we should start charging for this.
Yeah, well, I'm glad this works.
Oh, this is a blast, man. This is a blast.
So I'm just curious because I scoured the interwebs, as we say, and one of the things that you mentioned was the idea of believing in things that can't possibly be true. And so I guess my question is that the case because we are misinterpreting much of what was meant to be metaphorical? Of course, I'm speaking in terms of like scripture and holy writings. Or are we just creating myths and structures in order to feel safer and more complete?
That's a good question.
That's a really good question.
Excellent. My job here is done.
I'm trying to think who it was. Was it Crossan or somebody who recently said, like, I'm not trying to tell you that ancient people were speaking literal, or were dumb enough to mean things literally when they're clearly just metaphors, and now we're smart enough to interpret them as myths. I'm actually telling you the opposite. I'm telling you they meant them as myths, and we're dumb enough to take them as literal, right? So I can't remember who that was. I think it might have been Crossan, but I can't remember.
Okay.
Right. So yeah, I'm sorry. I kind of lost my train of thought there.
That's okay.
So you're asking about sort of the nature of how we construct myths and why they're important to us?
Yeah, because I feel like when you were discussing your book, God Isn't Conscious, the feeling I got was kind of that, human beings by nature feel the sense of alienation and separation. And so we tend to strive for something to fill that void, in this case it would be, the love of God. But it seems to be kind of this unattainable goal, right? So I wonder if maybe some of the issue isn't that we aren't just misinterpreting the true meanings behind these ancient writings, or if we're just constructing, myths and structures just so we can feel a little bit safer, a little bit more complete, a little more whole.
Right. Well, I think that's that's a good question, but and there's so many different ways that you could go with that. I think that one of the more helpful things to studying old texts in general and in psychoanalysis in particular is that even the author doesn't really know what they mean all the time, right?
Yeah.
And this is particularly dangerous when I'm writing a book about a very personal theory of trauma, about the psyche and about how trauma works. There's absolutely no possibility that I didn't put way more about myself than I meant to in my book, right?
Oh, man.
And that's true of any. People look at things that Paul wrote. So like one example is that. So Paul seems like pretty myth free. Like Paul seems very pragmatic. Like he's kind of giving, arrange yourselves these ways, do these things, don't do these other things. Like, it's pretty simple, right? Like, so there's not a whole lot of myth or space for interpretation on that level.
Yeah.
But the space for interpretation in Paul is the why. Like, why does he say this thing? So when he has this idea about how relationships work or something, and he's talking kind of disparagingly about women or something, and then someone will say, like, well, does Paul actually know why he's writing this? Like, what's his opinion on why this is an important thing to include in this text? So Paul was part of I think he was part of the Sanhedrin, yes? Like,
Yeah.
So there's this theory of like, okay, well, usually to do that, you had to be married. So what happened so Paul's not married. Did his wife die? Was he given an exemption? Never married? Was he married at some point and then divorced? What caused that? Like, so there's kind of there's this whole other level of, okay, so somebody says XYZ. Why did they say XYZ? Does their XYZ matter to me? Or can I completely disagree with their experience, have nothing close to it in my background, and still find meaning out of it?
Man.
So I don't know if that sort of gets at your question, but hopefully that's a little bit helpful.
No, that's great.
And then I think what we end up doing is typically what the answer is. And, that pastor that you were telling us about, that you'd sit with and ask these questions that are good questions, and he would give you stifling answers, very stifling answers. I think that if somebody asked that same question specifically about Paul, did Paul know why Paul was writing what Paul's writing? The typical answer would just be, well, the Holy Spirit.
Right.
And then you're just done. And you can't ask any more questions after that. It's just it's the trump card. It's like, that's it. It's like, don't ask me any more questions.
If that works for people, then I say just stay happy with it.
Yeah,
just keep
totally.
running. That's a way easier answer.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Now my wager would be that actually that perspective on things is going to lead to other things that will be very problematic in your life. If you're that willing to sort of just give your authority for interpretation over that easily, my wager is that is going to produce a lot of problems for you in the course of life. But if it's working for you now, it's a hell of a lot easier than trying to rethink things.
We always say, man, we're not trying to lead people anywhere where they don't want to go.
So anyone who's ever made a mess of things should have mercy, mercy.
All right, let's talk a little bit about your book, man.
Okay. All right.
The first thing I thought when I started, because I don't know anything about Lacan, I don't know about Deleuze, I don't know about some of these guys. I just know enough about Derrida to be dangerous and not in like a cool.
That's how it starts.
Not in like a cool James Dean dangerous kind of way. Like, that guy's an idiot kind of dangerous, like, sort of way. So, but anyway, I started reading this stuff and I'm like, oh my gosh, there is a whole world of thought out there that has unbelievable applications that are practical, that can help us understand ourselves. Because one of the things I like about talking to you is you bring together things that seem to give us an understanding, a multifaceted understanding. So, like, I'm not a big Calvin fan, but one of the things that Calvin said in his Institutes in the very beginning was all of life, should consist in two things: knowledge of self and knowledge of God. And so it seems like the intersection or the tangling or, even the entanglement of these two knowledges is something that your book kind of touches on. And I could be completely wrong, but that's the world that seemed to kind of open up in new language and new territory. And it's so new that I wonder if you could just give us get our feet wet, talk a little bit about what you mean. You touched on unconsciousness, but what is the book getting at? What do you hope to do with the book God is Unconscious?
Yeah, man, maybe I'm more of a Calvinist than I thought I was. That's kind of disconcerting. Yeah. What I'm arguing in this book is that psychoanalysis helps us think not about what's the correct belief, but instead how does all belief work. And again, I'm not trying to argue that religion itself is just a fiction. I'm trying to argue that all truth has the structure of a fiction, and we kind of need to think through how we produce truth, how we trick ourselves into participating in certain types of reality. Because if you don't think about those things, then you get caught up in the bad religion, the bad relationship, the bad politics, the mundane life. You get caught up in these things if you're not thinking about how they work. So like every belief has this structure of a fiction. Every way that we remember something is always a misremembering. One of the things that psychoanalysis is aimed at is, well, Lacan put it this way. There's this term called the big other that you probably saw all throughout the text, right?
Yes,
All right. So the
yes.
big other for someone like Lacan is like God is one way that the big other might look. The big other might be that voice in your head that's criticizing you, or that voice in the head that also on come Friday night is also telling you to go out and enjoy the world more, right? So it might judge you for enjoying, but it's also telling you to get out and enjoy. It might be your parents. It might be a lover or a friend. It might be your books or your philosophies or whatever. So like there is this big other figure that most of the time when you're feeling anxious about something, you're always thinking, what does another want, right? Like what does God want? Or when you feel anxious when you're interacting with somebody for the first time, you're thinking, do they think that I'm an idiot? Do they think that I'm funny? These types of things, right? Like anxiety is always about another person. What does that other want? So when people come into psychoanalysis, like what Lacan would say is that basically you can think about it like this: psychoanalysis will be over when they realize that the big other does not exist. But he doesn't mean that whatever problem or whatever person you're trying to care about, just like I don't mean your God, it doesn't mean that you have a problem with your wife and then you realize that your wife doesn't exist, right? Like it means that you probably realize that that particular way of understanding somebody doesn't need to have that kind of operative power. So here's an example that I use from time to time. There's a story of this girl who is this model child, and does everything in order to please her parents, right? So she's getting the right grades, she's dating the right people, she's a team player, she's obedient. Everything that she does, the parents are pleased with, and in everything she does, she's actually trying to get more of those parents' approval, right? So you can imagine how, so you probably know this type of person, right? And you can imagine she gets the right grades through school, dates the right people, goes to the right college, gets the right job at the right firm afterwards, gets married, has the kids, everything in some way to get that parent's approval. Now let's suppose that some tragic night she gets the phone call about the drunk driver on the other side of the road, and now her parents are gone, right? Does anything about her world change in her concrete day-to-day existence, right? She has anxiety, she has sadness, her relationships start to fray. But in a way, the death of the father actually makes things all the more demanding that you obey, right?
Wow.
So there's no longer anyone saying like, I'm judging you if you don't get into the right school or do the right thing with your life, but she still is going to feel, her language will change. I guess this is an important thing because this is what we do with theology, right? We rearrange the language, but we keep all the same ideas without realizing that what we've done to ourselves,
Sure,
right?
sure.
So she'll start to say, instead of, I hope my parents are proud of me, she'll start to say, I hope my parents would have been proud of me, or I hope my parents are looking down from heaven proud of me, right? She'll rearrange the language, but everything that she's doing, if she's been doing it her whole life to please her parents, she will still be trying to please her parents, right? So when she goes to psychoanalysis, the analyst does not need to convince her that her parents are dead. She knows that. Her ego, her consciousness knows that her parents are dead. That is not a secret, right? The analyst needs to convince the parents that they're dead.
Wow.
Right. So that is what Lacan means by it's not that we need to tell you that you need to like break off a relationship or stop believing in God or something like that. It's that you need to you don't need to tell like me that God is dead, right? Like I need to like God needs to realize that God is dead, or I don't need to realize that this belief doesn't work. I need that belief needs to realize it doesn't work, right? So again, like so that's the kind of the way that this works. Is it's not like an all out assault against saying like you need to believe more correct things, right? Like that's boring. Like you can read another book for that, right? My book is not going to be good for that. My book is interested in why it is that we attach to certain versions of reality in our head and try to please those in ways that they can't ever be pleased, right? So again, if we were to resurrect that girl's parents from our story a moment ago and ask them, did she do enough to please you? They would say what every parent says. Of course she, like, we love her and she never had to do anything to please us, right? Like she was just trying to please a version of us in her head. And we're really glad that version is gone if analysis was successful, right?
Man.
So that's the kind of thing I'm interested in, is not an argument about atheism and theism per se so much. So that's not quite what I'm interested in, although there's clearly implications for it.
Sure.
I'm interested in how those ideas become things that we attach ourselves to and won't let go of them.
Man.
Cool thing. All right.
I mean, dude.
Sense.
Sometimes we just need a little space on this podcast so I can catch up. That was. I'm sitting here. So wait a second. How then do you you obviously can't tell me. Like, does it ever happen? What does it look like when God realizes God is dead? When the other realizes the other's not there anymore, the other doesn't exist. I mean, how would that manifest?
So I'm like a pastor from way back. So I actually still get people who will reach out to me and this is going on like 6 or 7 years ago now. I get people who will still reach out to me on a fairly regular basis, several people, and several people will ask something to the effect of, like either I become a more progressive Christian or I become an atheist altogether or something like that. And I'll say, okay, so like I've started, like I've been an atheist. I don't go to church anymore, but like, tell me this, like, do you think that the arguments about evolution or climate science or sexuality or something like that, like, what do you think about those things, right? Like, so to still come back to the same master signifier beliefs of evangelicalism, because we all know that, like, evangelicalism, like, we'll say that it's all about Jesus, but really it has a lot more to do sort of in day-to-day life with, like, sexuality and cultural identity, race, these kinds of things. Like there's a lot of other sort of things bound up in it. And so people will tell me in the same breath, I've left this faith, but then they'll ask me like something related to that faith still. Right. And that's a very common thing. And I don't think that that's weird at all. I think that's a completely normal thing. The moment that they stop asking that question, because I've also seen people like stop asking those questions altogether anymore, that's when the bigger doesn't exist for them anymore. Right. Like when they've moved on and those beliefs no longer cause anxiety for them. That's sort of when they've moved on. So there's this example Lacan uses about kids when they first start to notice themselves in the mirror. Like when an infant notices that its reflection is actually the same being that's doing the looking, that's like developmentally, that's a big deal, right? Like that's when it has enough conscious development, like the synapses are able to make the connection that what they're seeing is them and not some other thing, right? Okay, so they get to this point and they're able to see themselves in the mirror and understand that the being looking back at them is them. Lacan has this point where he says, what does the infant do every time? What every infant that ever notices itself in the mirror for the first time, what do? Every single time they will turn back around and like see if their caregiver, their mother or father, is smiling, nodding along, right? Like, yeah, that really is you in the mirror, right? Like, so they want that affirmation. So Lacan goes, yeah, stupid story about a kid, right? How interesting is it that from our earliest moment of subjectivity, we absolutely demand that someone else ratify what we're seeing in front of us?
Whoa!
Right? Like.
Whoa.
Like, so what would it be like if an infant was so confident in itself that it didn't require the mother's ratification? If it was just like, here I am, don't need anybody else to tell me what I see, right? Like that would actually be kind of like that kid would grow up to be a monster, right? Like
I
that.
was just thinking the same thing. I'm like, I don't know if that's a good thing.
Yeah, it's a very overconfident child.
It's a very overconfident child. It's probably going to have some like overconfidence issues at best, and terrible ethical issues at worst, right? Like,
Right.
so we actually do kind of need that big other figure. Like I mean,
Yeah.
that's inescapable. That's not something that like the atheist has like suddenly no big other. Like, you're not going to get away from that. But you need to think about how that's working for you. Who are the people that you're trying to please? What are the fictions in your imagination that you're spending your life trying to appeal to, right? So yeah.
Oh my gosh. Oh man.
Yeah.
That is
Wow.
so. Oh.
So I guess because we have a very, like as I said earlier, a very broad audience
Right.
of people all over the spectrum, which is I think the thing that we love the most about what we do. And so we always give our guests an opportunity to kind of speak to both crowds, because I think our goal has always been to kind of virtually, even though we can't see the people listening, obviously, but our goal is to always in a virtual way kind of get them to at least turn towards one another and start the kind of productive dialogue that we just don't see happening right now. It seems to be a lot of what we refer to as this red-faced, fish shaking kind of closed up, shouty conversation that you see on a lot of media, sources. So what would you say to both sides, and how would people who are going through kind of that season of doubt or those struggles kind of apply your work to what we would call their journey of deconstruction?
Yeah, well, my rule of thumb, as I mentioned before, is that I am always partly wrong 100% of the time. I'm always at least partly wrong, right? And I think that's a good rule of thumb for anybody. Dogmatism exists on the left and the right. And I do have my perspective, so I don't want to pretend like I'm not a big like both sides, everybody has it equally wrong, both sides have a point. Like I actually do kind of want to avoid that. But I think that we need to disagree very clearly, but like not be afraid to disagree, right? Like so, and this is kind of an idea from Hegel, the philosopher, but the way that you make progress is actually you do need to state your terms in as clear as possible a way and figure out what the differences are. So like when two people disagree, if they both kind of say, I have this perspective, you have that perspective, but let's just kind of get in the middle and say, let's only talk about the things that we both agree on, right? Like that's actually kind of a weak relationship. Right. It's actually, and if you were not in a conversation between friends, but you were actually trying to debate two ideas, it's actually impossible to move forward in that context. It's actually important that people in secure relationships or in debates where you want to take an idea somewhere to state your terms as clear as possible. I need to know where the differences are between you and I, right? Like if we're hashing out an idea, right? We don't get anywhere if we don't state our terms as clearly as possible. And it is easy for that to become disrespectful and hostile. Like that's the problem, right?
Yes.
It's actually not the disagreement that's a problem. The disagreement is a good thing. If we didn't disagree at some point, but way back in our past about like whether or not it was okay to like slaughter the neighboring tribe in the neighboring cave, like we would have gone nowhere, right? Like disagreement is the foundation of civilization, but it needs to happen in a certain way, right? So I guess maybe like when I talk to people who come from like more of the perspective that I used to have. I want to say to them, I genuinely think you are dangerously wrong. I also understand that you are sincere in your faith, that you are a great person, and that you do this for the best of reasons, right? So like to me, like, that's always kind of like, that's a weird place to navigate, I guess.
Yeah.
Because I mean, like most of the people I know and love, coming as I do from Arkansas, have very, very different perspectives than I do, right? Like,
oh my gosh, yeah.
right. So I don't actually think that like trying to pretend like we all believe the same thing at the end of the day, or that both sides have a point. I don't actually think that that's helpful. But I do think that that can be done in a respectful way, I suppose.
Yeah.
Oh, perfect.
Man, you couldn't have said it any better. I think that's a really great place. We want to be respectful of your time and the time of our listeners. So here's, I'm going to put you on this. This is not a live broadcast, but I'm going to leave this in here as if we were live and millions of people were listening to this.
Yes.
Okay. All right. All right. Very good.
I feel like I just dipped my toes in some of the water of, the depths of what you can, bring to the table in conversation here. Would you please come back and dive a little deeper into some of this stuff? I feel like we just touched on Lacan, and there's so many cool ideas. I'm asking you in front of all these people, Tad, will you please?
I would absolutely love to. We actually got through about a fifth of the notes that I took down.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we barely touched on sort of like the main bit of my book, and like the next one I have coming up. I'm very excited. I think that your listeners will really like the next material that I'm doing. That's kind of more at a readable, accessible level.
Okay, so I'll take that as you're coming back at least 4 more times if we only got through a fifth.
To. Absolutely. Yeah.
So since you mentioned it, when is the new book coming out?
Yeah.
The new book, it'll be called The Cynic and the Fool. And I guess I don't even think we really even got into that. But it is going to come out either in late this year or early springtime next year. It's completely done, other than aside from a few edits, and then I'm hopefully deciding on publisher options in the next couple weeks. So we'll see.
Well, if you want any opinions on copies, we love to read things, and I think we just decided on our next episode title. It's going to be called The Cynic and the Fool with Tad DeLay, and it's going to coincide with your book release, because we cannot wait to get our hands on that.
Okay, well, great. Yeah, I mean, and I'll be happy to come back on, when it's closer to that happening, if you guys would like.
That'd be awesome.
We would love it.
Yeah, that's great.
Well,
I had a great time though.
Oh, yeah, Tad DeLay, it is with great pleasure and enthusiasm that we say thank you for coming on the show, and we will definitely be looking forward to your return.
All right. Great talking to you guys. Thank you.
I was like, "Do you go? Do I go?"
Well, I didn't know what to go, but I didn't want to edit that out, because again, I feel like so often we reach the end of these things, and I would love to have all these really well rehearsed thoughts, but that's just not the environment we want to produce here. This is raw and authentic and real, and man, dude,
I loved what he said about, and I think we put this up on the Instagram a few days ago, just about disagreement being the foundation of society or something along those lines.
Civilization.
Yeah, civilization. Yeah, because without disagreement,
right,
there would be no progress. There would be no. So
it's the tug and tow, man.
Dude,
the push and pull.
I love that, because that's one of my favorite responses to that question that we always ask,
Absolutely loved it. Mm-hmm. And what a perfect guy to answer that question. Here's a guy raised, evangelical pastor, gave it all up, went sort of, into the quote darkness, as it were, and found this new sort of beautiful light. But it doesn't look like Christianity. It doesn't look like faith in the terms that we would traditionally use. But man, so brilliant. My favorite part of the podcast was when he was illustrating the point where he used the story of the guy that got hung on the gallows. I think it was Peace.
Yeah, his last name was Peace. Yep.
Oh my gosh, man! Like that sort of point, using psychoanalysis and using Lacan and pointing out the inconsistencies in what we say we believe. I think is probably one of the healthiest things that can happen to anyone.
Yeah.
And that is why, but traditionally, that kind of pointing out inconsistencies ends up turning out to be just, you sound like an asshole.
Yeah.
to put it lightly. It's like debates on YouTube are nauseating to me. I can't watch them. I mean,
Agreed.
I can very rarely watch them because it's just this pissing contest. It's like it's called like right fighting, right?
Yeah.
Where it's like I don't even necessarily care what I have to say as long as I win,
Yeah.
right?
And half the time it ends up kind of falling into this weird thing where you're not even making an intellectual argument. It's just like, well, you're stupid.
Right. I'm just
And-
going to belittle you. So the thing I like about Tad is he's coming up with this. He's presenting a lens or a mirror or a matrix or whatever you want to call it that shows and reveals deep, deep inconsistencies in beliefs that we say we hold and how those beliefs actually work, how they function, and how the unconscious and the ego drive these things and really tangle them up and confuse them. And the lies that we tell ourselves, the lies that we expect others to keep telling us, man, I could have listened to this guy all day.
Oh, yeah. I think there's definitely a good excuse to have him back again in the future.
Oh, I can't wait.
And that new book, oh, man.
I can't wait. I hope he sends us a copy of that, man.
I know.
That was so good. So I hope you guys are as dumbfounded as I am right now.
Mm-hmm.
I hope you all want to just go back, listen to it again, check this guy out, grab his book. It's one of those books, I'll be honest, I think I said this on the interview.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to read it. It is dense, but it is a gold mine.
Mm-hmm.
It's a gold mine. It's starting to, you almost learn new language, you learn new vocabulary, like this concept of the big other. Like I couldn't wrap my head around that at first, but once I did, I started to see it everywhere.
Yeah.
And just how motivating it actually is to so many things that we do. So I think this guy is a gold mine. I think he's going to blow stuff up, and I can't wait to see the response from his more popular work that's about to come out. And I just can't believe we got him this early. I mean, I just feel so lucky.
Super, super nice guy, though, too. I mean,
Fantastic.
I can't reiterate the fact enough that so many of these folks who have come on our show, who have given us their time, and I think you guys know it goes without saying that we're not paying these dudes and these people to come on. So it's just so nice of them to share their time with us and to share some of these, like this amazing work that a lot of these people have done. I mean, a lot of these folks that we have on our authors, and like just so humble, so kind, so giving.
So much so.
So yeah, hopefully you guys just really enjoyed that. So
yeah, absolutely. And the music on this episode is by a band called Civilian.
yeah, tell
And
us
so
about them.
if you like they're from Nashville. Derek Webb turned us on to these guys, and let me tell you something. If you're into like the Wilco, they kind of remind me of like a Wilco meets Death Cab for Cutie, but fresh. It's got some good American rock, and the lyrics.
Oh my
are
gosh,
unbelievable, and I think fit with our sort of podcast mentality of just struggling, having no idea what you believe, but feeling the existential weight of the struggle itself. So this track that we're about to play right now is called it's off the record Fear and Trembling, and the link for it is in the show notes. But check out Civilian. We hope you enjoy. Please follow us on Twitter at DeconstructCast. Check us out on Facebook as the Deconstructionist Podcast.
same thing with Twitter or
Instagram,
and
leave us a review on iTunes.
yeah,
And please, the most important thing you can do for us guys is to share this.
yeah.
Share it with as many people as you can in as many ways as you can, so we get more voices that continue to form and inform this space. We do this for you. We know that being in a place of deconstruction and reconstruction is a weird, scary, anxiety-laden space, and we want this to be a place where you can connect with others like you, feel like you have a home if you're feeling kind of homesick, and know that you are not alone. And the more you share this, the more that becomes a reality for the next person.
Right.
So please continue to share this. I just can't stress that enough. If you'd like to donate, we do this all out of our own pockets, and we've gotten a few donations, but if we want to keep this thing going, it would be really great if some more people could pitch in. We are working on a Patreon site, but look in the show notes or on our website, thedeconstructionists.com. Click donate. There's a Squarespace store, $5, $10, $25, just a little bit of money just to keep us going with space and equipment and production costs. And I'm not going to bore you guys with all that stuff, but enjoy this track from Civilian. John, you got anything else to say?
Just some big things coming up in the very near future that we can't wait to share with you guys.
Man.
Some stuff that we're really excited about, some possible trips. And that's all I'll say about that.
Oh, dude, we got some stuff brewing.
Oh, and keep, especially on Twitter, keep suggesting people that you want us to talk to.
It works almost every time.
We've gotten some amazing guests based off of your suggestions.
Yes.
People that maybe weren't on our radar.
Yes.
But are now firmly in our radar.
Yes.
So keep that coming,
Greg
man.
Boyd.
Those have been so good. Tony Jones.
Sarah Bessie.
Yeah.
So many.
Yep.
We
got some good stuff.
We got some Easter eggs coming for you guys, man. and it's past Easter, but we're just gonna give them to you all year long.
Yep.
We love you guys. We do this all for you. All the feedback and the responses and the questions and the criticisms and the love and the angst. All of it matters to us. We love it all. We love you guys. We do this all for you. Keep journeying. Don't do it alone. Keep deconstructing and reconstructing. For now, we are your hosts. I'm Adam Narlock.
And I'm John Williamson.
Until next time.
The woman set to sleep around was rounded up and hunted down, and by her hair they drug her out into the dusty street. The men then spit upon the whore, disgusting no one's eyes but yours. You kneeled a thumb, a masterpiece, and the bastards dropped their stones. So anyone who's ever made a mess of things should have mercy, mercy. I have found true love to be my open eyes of disbelief, a broken heart that drops its jaw and lets you kiss its cheek. Some days I am torn between if Judas is more you than me, the risen king that seems to speak to anyone but me. So forgive me when I don't know what to do with you. I want to, I really want to. So anyone with a heart to know this mystery, fear and trembling, and anyone who couldn't make sense of things should have mercy, fear and trembling, for they truly know the full effect of the undertow.
Prescription products require completion of an online medication consultation with an independent healthcare provider through the LifeMD platform and are only available if prescribed. Subscription required. Individual results may vary. Additional restrictions apply at lifemd.com. Read all warnings before using GLP-1s. Side effects may include a risk of thyroid C-cell tumors. Do not use GLP-1s if you or your family have a history of thyroid cancer.
If you've struggled for years to lose weight and have given up hope, did you know you can now access GLP-1 prescription medications through LifeMD? LifeMD is now offering eligible patients online access to GLP-1s, the breakthrough prescription medication that can help you lose body fat and weight. Listen to what people are saying.
I've been able to live my normal lifestyle, and I've lost 20 pounds already. It changed my life.
I wasn't expecting it to shut off the food noise. This was life-altering, and if I can do it, I feel like anybody can do it.
And here's the best part. Your insurance may cover 100% of the cost of your medication. So go to TryLifeMD.com to have your eligibility checked right now. Get started today at TryLifeMD.com. That's TryLifeMD.com.